IKIM FM, inspirasi utama anda. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good afternoon to our dear listeners of IKIM FM. Welcome to this special interview. I'm your host, Patricia Afrina. Alhamdulillah, thank you very much for listening to us from wherever you are. Either you are listening to this through radio or even through our social media pages, Facebook and YouTube. So in this episode of special interview, I'm honored to be in the presence of Honorary Associate Professor Peter Slezak, who is a renowned Australian philosopher from School of Humanities and Languages, University of New South Wales, Sydney. Welcome to our studio, Professor.
Thanks, Patricia.
It is such a pleasure to have you in our studio for today. How are you?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is your first time being in Malaysia?
No, I've been a few times. It's been a great pleasure to be here on a couple of occasions, which have been very interesting, and I've enjoyed them very much.
It's such an honor to hear it from you, Professor. So for our listeners, some background about Professor Peter Slezak. Honorary Associate Professor Peter Slezak is a philosopher at the University of New South Wales, which is widely recognized for his outspoken advocacy for Palestinian rights and his strong criticism on Isra-li state policies. And as the son of Holocaust survivors, Professor Slezak uses his platform to challenge dominant pro-Israel narratives and to highlight the ongoing oppression faced by the Palestinians. And he has written and spoken extensively in supporting of Palestinian self-determination, and in his work describing Israel's action as systemic violations of international law and human rights. And to his public engagement, academic writings, and also activism, Professor Slezak stands as a prominent Jewish voice confronting Zionism, occupation, and the apartheid-like conditions imposed on Palestinians. So to get the ball rolling for today's conversation, Professor, as a descendant of Holocaust survivors, your parents, I'm sure, must have shared with you some harrowing stories of what they went through, what of them endured, especially at Auschwitz. So could you share with our audience what was it like growing up bearing the weight of having that history in your name, and how it shaped your worldview, especially on how eventually it led you to become one of the most vocal Jewish advocates for Palestinian rights?
Well, it's a long story, but thanks for asking. Look, I grew up, like most people in my generation, especially in Australia, from parents who were survivors of the European Nazi Holocaust.
Yeah.
Both my parents were survivors. My mother and grandmother, in fact, both were in the notorious Nazi death camp, Auschwitz, in Poland, which I'm going to visit for the first time coming up soon, which is kind of daunting. But I grew up with their stories. And as a kid, like other Jewish kids of my age, we grew up with these stories either directly from our parents or from others of our parents' generation. And these are very formative because they are horror stories. Unprecedented horrors.
Yeah.
And my head was full of these stories that my parents would tell. So the interesting question really, I suppose, is why I ended up in the position I have where I'm strongly critical of Israel. I have family in Israel. Some of the Holocaust survivors of my family, my mother's cousin, I met him, he had the Auschwitz tattoo on his arm, the way my mother didn't get it because she was condemned to go to her death to the gas chambers early. She survived. But my uncle, for example, as you may be aware, many of the inmates had a tattoo on there.
Is it the one number?
A number. They have a number tattoo on their forearm. And my uncle had that. I visited him in Israel. So I have family in Israel that were also Holocaust survivors and their children. So as it happens also, my Zionist credentials are kind of unique. My mother's first cousin, his name was Steve Gerstel. He was the federal head in Australia of the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, which is one of the leading Zionist organizations doing fundraising for the State of Israel. And in fact, they have a quasi-government status because they own enormous amounts of the land in Israel.
Okay.
And this enables them to discriminate against the Palestinians. So they can buy the land from the Palestinians, but the Palestinians can't live there and can't own it and work the land. So there's a long story about my family where I was in this Zionist family, in a Zionist community. In fact, I have a picture of my uncle, my mother's cousin, with Ben-Gurion, who was the first president of the State of Israel. So this is my family background. So how did I end up being an anti-Zionist Jew is a good question. Part of the story is that, unlike most of my friends when I was a kid, most of my friends went to Jewish day camp or summer school camp for a week or two, and they would be really basically brainwashed into Zionism. And for whatever reason, I didn't go to these camps, these summer schools, summer holidays. I don't know why. I can't remember why I didn't go. But I missed out on this brainwashing of Zionism when I was young. But I wasn't really political, and I didn't have any view until, as I got older and I went to, for one thing, in my generation, I was in the generation that were very critical of the American involvement and Australian involvement in the Vietnam War.
Okay.
That was in the 60s.
1960s.
Yeah, in the late 1960s. So I was a student then. And I mean, it's a rather long story, but I started a science degree, which I didn't finish. I was kind of a dropout. And because I was a dropout, I went from Sydney University to New South Wales University in the middle of the Vietnam period, and all my teachers were active politically. They were strongly opposed to the Vietnam War. They were demonstrating, and they talked politics. My Jewish friends had successful careers because they weren't dropouts, and they became Zionists and professionals and didn't become very critical at all. So I had this accident where I found myself with a bunch of lefties at the university taking politics and human rights seriously. And so that was the beginning of a kind of political maturation. I became a bit more mature, and of course then I went to graduate school. I mean, I had a successful academic career after that, but I went to America and studied at Columbia University, and there I became introduced to radical alternative views of Israel.
Okay.
Chomsky, for example, Noam Chomsky, who's one of the most important Jewish writers critical of Israel, and others in the environment there, where suddenly I realized, of course, there's a whole other story. And that was the beginning of my journey towards learning more. And the more you learn about Zionism and the founding of the state, the worse it is. It's a horrible story. And most people don't know the story. And in fact, while I'm talking, I should mention the mythology that most people in the world were convinced by was a movie that was made called Exodus. Exodus. It starred the beautiful Eve Marie Saint and Paul Newman, and this was actually the story of the Jews fleeing the Holocaust, fleeing the Nazi Holocaust, coming to Israel.
Okay.
That's a true story, basically, but this was a mythologized version. And the uncle I mentioned with the tattoo on his arm in Israel, he was part of that wave of Jews that entered what was then British mandate control of Palestine, and basically they overwhelmed Palestine, and in the end the British left. They were killing the British, the Jews, the terrorists, actually, Jewish terrorists, were blowing up the famous the King David Hotel and assassinating the soldiers. The British left, and so that was the story that this movie tells is significant because this influenced the whole generation in the West. Basically, there are no Palestinians. The myth was that this was, in fact, the theme song of that movie, it's worth mentioning, is, I won't try to sing it, but the melody, the words were, "This land is our land. God gave this land to me." For goodness sake, these are European Jews saying that God gave Palestine to the European Jews who had nothing to do with it.
Not even originally from...
No, it's all mythology.
I see.
And even if you go back in history, whatever the history is, it's not relevant that maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years ago there was some Jewish presence there. The archaeology shows that. What's that got to do with people like me? I have more rights to this day in Israel than my friends who are Palestinians who are still holding the key to their house that they were evicted from in the ethnic cleansing. So this is the story in a nutshell of the founding of the State of Israel.
And of course, with your extensive work right now, that from the result of it, you have become widely recognized as one of Australia's most prominent pro-Palestinian Jewish voices from your courageous work in pursuit of justice for Palestine. However, not every act of advocacy is met with praise. So with your stance has drawn, I believe, criticisms from your own Jewish community, and especially we would like to talk on the Australia Jewish community itself. actually, how is your work perceived by them? Because I came across in one of your interviews online where you mentioned that you were labeled as self-hating Jews or even capo. So can you further elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, look, this is an ongoing conflict. There are many Jews like me around the world. It's not like in America, especially, there are large groups of Jews who say, "Not in our name." They use these slogans to suggest that Israel can't act on their behalf because they reject this idea that Israel is a Jewish state which acts for Jews, as I do. I reject that. And predictably, the strong Zionist forces in the Jewish community respond to this in the most awful ways. You use the word capo. Most
Capo.
people, capo, you know what that means?
No, I don't know.
Okay, I better explain it. It's probably the worst thing you can say to a Jew, especially like me, whose parents survived the Holocaust. The capo was the term that was used for the Jews who were the traitors, who collaborated with the Nazis. In the concentration camps, the Nazis used some of the Jews as their kind of agents in the camp to control the rest of the Jews.
Okay.
Some of them after the war were killed by the Jews. They were rightly hated. They were awful in their cruelty towards their fellow Jews. So the idea of a capo is a Jew who's a traitor and who betrays his own people. And because it comes from the concentration camps, the capos were those Jews who betrayed the Jews in the camps. And they're hated for good reason. So you can understand if the Jews, as they do, regularly call people like me capo, how deeply offensive, deliberately offensive and insulting that is. That's the worst thing you can say. I mean, in a way, it's, of course, a difficulty we have to deal with because the Jews, like myself, are standing in the name of what we take to be the appropriate principles of a decent person. And by the way, it's not necessarily Jewishness. I should say that I'm a Jew by birth. My parents were Jewish, and I had a bar mitzvah, as Jews do when they're 13. It's kind of like a confirmation ceremony when you're 13. But I'm an atheist. I'm a non-believer. I'm not a practicing Jew.
All right.
Like many Jews, in fact, I have to tell you, most Israeli Jews and most American Jews are not believers. To be a Jew is to be a member of a community, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you are a believer or a practitioner of the faith. So that's important to say because most Israelis, Netanyahu is probably not a believer. I mean,
I've heard of that news before. Some speculate that he's actually not even religious.
Sorry?
Benjamin Netanyahu, I've heard that in some news reports that he's not even religious.
No, he's not. He's like many. He's a secular Jew, really.
Secular Jew.
I mean, I don't know how much they admit to this, but, even the most secular Jews will go to the synagogue twice a year for the high holy days. There are a couple of big events during the year that you go as a kind of a gesture. So it's a kind of an observance that's a cultural observance. It's not necessarily a matter of faith, conviction. And most Jews, it's important to say this because, in other words, the conviction or the support for Israel is not a religious conviction. It's a political allegiance to what is an ethno-nationalist, supremacist, apartheid program. And the history of it is shocking. One of the difficulties, you asked about my origin, I mean, when you start to learn about how bad things were in 48, I mean, one could go back to 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, but if you just start in 1948 with the ethnic cleansing, the truth about that came out. A couple of significant Jewish scholars, historians, Ilan Pape, Avi Shlaim, even Benny Morris, a couple of Jewish historians were starting to reveal how terrible it was. The massacres, to this day, some of the leading Jewish leaders, like in Australia recently, they just want to deny this, but it's overwhelmingly established. The evidence is shocking and clear.
Yeah, can it be denied?
Even before the war broke out in 1948, they had ethnically cleansed several of the major Israeli cities. 300 or so thousand Jews were already driven out. And there were the massacres like in Deir Yassin. I visited there. It's a horror story. And so Israel was born from this atrocity and major ethnic cleansing and crime. And they've been having to struggle to deal with this, and to this day, they're not really facing the reality of that. So the first thing you find out when you discover the history, what a shocking story Zionism has been, the truth about Zionism. So it's hard to understand why anybody could be a Zionist and have a conscience. That's my basic position.
Yeah, it's very, I would say, it's kind of make me, it's very, very, very weird for me, because to see on social media, right, thanks to now that nowadays we have the advancement of technology, the advancement of social media. Now we have the online, we have the community journalism, where nowadays the media is not like we used to, where it's not heavily influenced or heavily censored by the government, that as long as it fits to their interest. But nowadays you can see directly, immediately, the impact that the genocide has towards the Palestinians. You can see, unfortunately, video of children, of cats, of parents losing their life on the street, and it's very sad to see that. But I really cannot fathom how can people still be supporting Israeli after seeing all this video. How can they still be in denial? How can they deny that? And listening, and in the initial of the conversation, you mentioned about how still at the very young age, the children were being brainwashed about, I believe, on the history of Israel, about the history of the Palestinians itself, to the point that it dehumanized, it reframed their mindset to dehumanize the Palestinians, so that they won't feel that really bad on the atrocity that being committed towards the Palestinians. And I was very scared of that, listening to that. As a So with that being said, now that they are being brainwashed, is it okay for us to say that they are not innocent, because they are actually, I would say, inside their own bubble? They do not know the reality of it.
Well, it may be worse than that. To a lot of extent, they do know the reality, and they're in denial, or they're in simply accepting the atrocities and not objecting. I struggle with this a lot, because it's shocking to me. I think the point you make is that the mainstream media, certainly in Israel, but even in Australia, is not showing enough of the horrors of what's going on in Gaza right now.
Yes.
It's beyond description. It's horror of such a scale. And I'm struggling with the fact that many Jews in Australia that I know are not concerned. It's hard to understand, because you wonder at a human level how you could not be distressed and outraged and horrified at atrocities on such a scale. This is a sickness. I mean, journalists like Gideon Levy in Israel say that most of Israel is supporting this genocide, and a lot of them in Israel think they're not going far enough. This is shocking and disgraceful. It's an obscenity, really.
Yes.
And I think, I'm sorry to say, that it's true of many of the Jews in Australia that I'm familiar with, and perhaps elsewhere. They find excuses to support what Israel is doing. They make excuses. If you read the Jewish press, it's very disturbing, because, as you said rightly, firstly, they dehumanize the Palestinians. You can hear it from the Israeli government leaders will talk about them as animals. And,
of course.
And that makes it then possible to treat them. I mean, we have a long history of this everywhere in the world. You dehumanize the other side, and then it makes possible to do terrible atrocities. We're not innocent of that either. The West, in the Second World War, we dropped the nuclear bombs on Japan.
Yes.
And we're guilty also of major atrocities and human rights violations. And it was possible then, as now, by dehumanizing, as you say, the other side. This is very serious, and it's very disturbing, because it's hard to understand how normal people, after all, can accept the horrors that we're seeing and not be affected emotionally. And of course, on the other side, I have many Palestinian friends, I'm proud to say. They're traumatized, understandably, and grieving at the state of this, and have to deal with this politics of... So, for example, it's important to mention, nowadays there's a movement around the world to make it anti-Semitic to criticize Israel.
Yeah.
This is the notorious definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA, which has become accepted all around the world. It's a political trick to silence critics of Israel.
Yes.
Because criticizing Israel as a political entity and what it does is not anti-Semitic. But in any case, whatever one's motives, the objective facts are what they are. And it's a distraction to focus on people's prejudices, even if they're real. But it's not racism, or it's not anti-Semitism, to point out what crimes, atrocities are being committed in the name of the Jews. So it's a long-standing, well-known, as I say, a trick that's used to silence criticism. And sadly, it works. because governments and organizations around the world have adopted this so-called definition of anti-Semitism, and the majority of the examples that are given are criticizing Israel. I'll give you an example. One of the examples always given of this definition, the IHRA definition, is to describe Israel as an ethnic nationalist or a racist endeavor.
Yes.
Now, the reality is that Israel is a racist, ethnic supremacist endeavor in the most objective sense. So, for example, on the law books, the legal arrangements in Israel, you can find out from Adala, which is a human rights organization based in Haifa. There are 50 laws on the books in Israel that discriminate against Israeli citizens who are Palestinian. So they're Israelis, but they're Palestinian. Then, in 2018, Israel, you have to know 20% of the Israeli population are actually not Jewish. They're Palestinians. And in 2018, Israel passed its so-called nation-state law, which actually said openly, explicitly, Israel is the state of the Jewish people only. Well, now that's just straight racist apartheid, and that's not the West Bank or Gaza, which is worse. This is Israel itself. So it's not a democracy. It's a democracy for Jews. But the Palestinians, although they have kind of a normal life in some respects, but legally and in many other ways they're discriminated against, and Israel doesn't recognize them as having the same status. So to be critical of Israel and to say that it's a racist endeavor or an apartheid, this is not anti-Semitism, it's simply a fact. And we're prevented, and people in public are now inhibited from being critical of Israel because they get tarred with this smear that, oh, you're a Jew hater.
Yeah.
Well, it's rubbish.
And obviously, anti-Semitism is being used as I would say, to divert the attention on what's truly matter. And talking about that, it reminded me of in one of the rally that you were a part of in University of Technology campus about the in the rally you mentioned about the having duty to make Jews uncomfortable, and you received a lot of response from them. And also when I read about that in one of the...
You've been following this very closely.
I do follow you closely, Professor. So of course you clarified that what you meant was that Jews are placed in an invidious position. Israel is claiming to speak on behalf of all Jews, and many of the response said that you're very racist to say about that, because in attack directly to a student who he was holding an Israeli flag.
Look, one of the things, I had a script and I was reading it out and I said Jews should be uncomfortable. I'll elaborate on that in a minute. But I looked over there and there was one of the Jewish students was holding a big Israeli flag.
Okay.
And I just said to him, and he especially should be uncomfortable, and he complained to the university that I made him feel unsafe, which is just rubbish. So this is the way it goes. And after all, holding an Israeli flag is about as provocative as you could be to a group of Palestinians who are grieving over the atrocities that are being committed under that flag.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. But in fact, I've thought a lot about this. My Palestinian friends are a bit careful. They will say Zionists should be uncomfortable, but I said Jews, and I got into trouble for that. But I defend that in the following way. The Jews around the world use a slogan, not in our name.
Not in our name.
That's just a polite way of saying what I'm saying. I'm saying, what does it mean, not in our name? It's a question to other Jews. Is it in your name? And if it is, you should be ashamed. Not just uncomfortable. So I, speaking to a rabbi, I have to tell you, a religious leader, and I told him my story of how I got into trouble because they complained and the university had to deal with my behavior. And when I said to him that I said Jews should feel uncomfortable, he said to me, the rabbi said, no, we should be ashamed. Now, there's a tradition in this way of thinking about it. So, for example, a famous rabbi, Joshua Heschel, during the American Civil Rights Movement, he marched with Martin Luther King in the streets, arm in arm, and he famously said, some people are guilty, but all should be uncomfortable. Some are guilty, but all are responsible, he said, not uncomfortable. Now, in other words, all Jews have a responsibility and can't avoid the responsibility that is being placed on them because it's being done in their name by the State of Israel and the Jewish leaders, the Jewish communities. The other important example of this is Desmond Tutu, the famous South African leader.
Yes.
He said, in a time of injustice, to be silent is to side with the perpetrator. In other words, silence is not an option when there are crimes being committed in your name. There are many good examples of leaders
Especially
who have
at
expressed
this-
what I'm trying to say,
Yes.
where I'm pointing to other Jews and saying you can't be silent because it's not an option morally
Yes.
to be silent at crimes which, whether you like it or not, as you said, it's an invidious position, but Jews now are placed in that position by the crimes of the state and the leading Jewish organizations. So it seems to me you have to stand up and speak out.
Because to silence is to agree on that. And I would like to still talking about because now if as in the earlier conversation you mentioned that now that if we want to criticize on the Zionism, they will relate it, oh, you're being anti-Semitic, when we know that anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist are two different things. It's not even the same. And obviously, it seems like the anti-Semitism here is being used as a tool to silence or to delegitimize criticism of Israel's policies toward Palestinians. And going further into that, I would like to still talk about the Jewish community itself. You mentioned just now the not in our names, right? The slogan that being used all around the world, if I'm not mistaken. In talking about that, actually, I would like to ask you, because you have been doing this for such a long time, how do you see going further, in fact, in the future, progressive has the community the Jewish community has become, are they becoming more open in having open discussion about the genocide being committed to Palestinians?
It's changing, especially the young people. My understanding of the data is that especially young people in America are no longer as uncritically supportive of the State of Israel. That's an important generational shift. I think that's what the data show. They're better informed and they perhaps don't have the same reflexive allegiance to Zionism. But I think that's an important shift. One indicator is the current mayoral candidate in New York City, Mamdani. New York is a Jewish city. I mean, it's, I don't know, a third or two-thirds are Jewish. And he speaks very forcefully and he's popular. And so that's a sign, I think it's a very hopeful sign, that there's a shift inside Jewish communities. For the reasons I was saying, and I mentioned the rabbi that I spoke to, it's becoming too hard to close your eyes and to look away from this. It's a horror that's beyond anything in our recent history. It's hard to really fathom the extent of it. And one of the worst things about it, the historian Ilan Pappé said, this is the end of Israel and the end of Zionism. He's very, grim in his prediction that it can't recover from this level of horror and crimes against humanity. And Jews will pay the price for this as well, because they are implicated in this, as I say, whether they like it or not, and they need to dissociate themselves, distance themselves from these horrors that are committed, and that's the crisis at the moment.
Anyway, they have responsibility. Of course, not that to the point that they should be feel guilty. They should, especially the young Jews, to feel guilty of it. But at the very least, they need to bear the responsibility on fighting for Palestinians. And I would like to read this one statement, and I would like to know your thoughts on it. This is one that I found on social media, and I don't know, when I read this, I feel that something that I really want to ask you about that. Okay, I want to know your opinion on it. So this person said, Zionism is not a trauma response to World War II, nor is about Judaism. Theodor Herzl was an atheist, and news to him were a race. Okay, Zionism is one of the last stands of one of the 19th century ethno-nationalism and not a reaction to Nazism. What's your thought on that?
Well, look, that's right. I mean, as we were saying, the founding of the Zionist program by Theodor Herzl had its motivations. Obviously, after the Second World War, it became a refuge for a lot of Jews, but that's irrelevant to the injustice of what was done to the Palestinians. The Palestinians aren't to blame for what the Nazis did.
Yes.
And they shouldn't pay the price for it, which they are.
Not even related.
Well, that's right. They ended up wearing the tragedy, the cost of this exodus from Europe and the ongoing migrations of waves. If you look at the data, I used to show waves and waves of Jews entered Palestine, and of course it caused enormous concern and rioting and justified outrage by the Palestinians, who lived very happily with the Jews for generations. My friends who were Palestinians and their parents will talk about how happily they looked after each other's children, and it was a harmonious relationship until Zionism came and really awfully overwhelmed Palestine. So the history of it, as you say, it's a sordid, dark history. Zionism is an ethnic nationalist, racist, supremacist program. That's all there is to it. It's not, and also people talk about settler colonialism today. We haven't used that word. This is perhaps one of the last what are called settler colonial regimes active. I mean, Australia, America, Canada, various other places were founded by these settler colonialists that displaced and exterminated, committed genocide on the native populations. In Australia, that's what happened. In America, this is an ongoing settler colonial project, and that's how it's been described in the literature, which helps you understand the injustice of it.
Of course.
And the fact that the Palestinians have a just cause. It's very sad that the world is letting them down, not just in Gaza, but how could this have gone on for so long?
For so long.
The injustice, the United Nations, I mean, endless resolutions. And the trouble is that the big powers, first Great Britain and now America, are basically siding with the criminals.
Yes.
And that's the tragedy.
Do we have any hope, or are there any external players who can, I would say, be a savior to help Palestinians?
Can there be any savior?
Do you think are there any countries or any organizations that can be a savior to stop them?
Behind the scenes, the public are not. The public in the various Arab countries are supportive of Palestine, but the leadership always are in cahoots with the leadership in Israel. So it's a very tragic situation. The only hope, I often give examples of other cases in which an injustice was overturned. After all, apartheid in South Africa was overturned finally. I think of, the Berlin Wall came down. I will also think of the East Timor tragedy, the occupation and the brutal Indonesian occupation of East Timor ended.
Yes.
It ended badly, but it ended when America decided to terminate it, to stop supporting it.
When they themselves decided that they want to stop.
Yeah, for whatever reasons politically, Australia was slow in coming to that. So there were cases where it didn't look like it would end, and I think the main lesson is that, as we do here in Malaysia and elsewhere, very active Palestine groups.
Yes.
And that's what changed in all of these. The Vietnam War ended because in America, domestically, it became intolerable. It was a huge cost, of course, after years of immense atrocities in Indochina, elsewhere, not just in Vietnam. But in the end, it became too costly domestically. I mentioned my history as a student in the anti-war movement, in the anti-Vietnam War. The outrage, the students and the general public became so angry, and demonstrations, as we're seeing now for Palestine, that changed things. It was slow. People like academics like my hero Noam Chomsky and various others came to public attention, speaking out at talks all over the place, and that had an effect. So it's hard to be hopeful, but it seems to me that is a good indication. I was thinking of the way apartheid ended. Also, activists around the world were strongly supporting it. There's one famous story, which I won't tell you in detail, but in Ireland, there's a department store called Dunn's Stores. Okay. And one of the young girls who was at the checkout, she refused to sell grapefruit that was banned because there was a BDS on the grapefruit, a boycott of the grapefruit. And she got into trouble. The boss called her into the office, and she went out, and then all of her co-workers went out. In the end, the whole country went out on strike. And in the end, the whole of Ireland ended up supporting the boycott of South Africa. And when Mandela visited, he visited with these young people from the store, and when he died, they were invited to his funeral. Now, I picked that because one young girl refused to sell a grapefruit, and that had a huge impact
It's part,
the movement
one after
had a big
another.
impact in Ireland.
Wow.
So what we're doing here in Malaysia, which is very, very admirable, and elsewhere, is the best hope we've got to pressure our governments to hold them to account. It's very hard because in Australia too, they've basically been missing in action. They're getting very heavily criticised at all the rallies for their complicity.
So it shows that even small matters, small efforts is crucial in helping Palestinians. And as we are reaching, I would say, the last segment for this interview, I'd like to ask you, this is actually the most that I look upon to. When we look at the conversation and arguments with the Zionists, with the pro-Israel, right? Many of them, in their arguments, seem to rely on a persistent narrative of self-defense. Israel has the right to defend themselves, especially after the October 7. They said of what Hamas did, but then I don't know. What would be appropriate response to, because for what Hamas did, it's not just something that's out of nowhere. It comes from years of pressure, years of genocide, years of discrimination that happened to them. It doesn't come from, out of nowhere. Because imagine, if I were to imagine myself being in the position, if you take away my home, if you kill my parents, if you kill my family, my friends, I'll be very mad. So talking about that, how should we critically understand and assess to the response given the long history of occupation and systemic violence? Do you think that the conversation around self-defense has been unfairly one-sided?
Look, Israel is not defending itself. It's true that the October 7 break through the fence and the acts they committed, they were crimes. I mean, one can condemn those. But I don't think it's fair to condemn them without condemning Israel for the greater crimes it has committed for a very long time. You made the point. It didn't come out of nowhere. The history didn't start on October 7. In fact, there was, in, I think, 2018, they were demonstrating against the barrier fence, the Gaza barrier. The Israeli army lined up behind a barrier and simply shot dead. Snipers were shooting unarmed Palestinians in great numbers and wounding them. The atrocities that Israel has been committing for years, successive wars which were never self-defense. So it has to be seen in that light. October 7 was a kind of a jailbreak. It was an attempt to break out. And it's unfair for Israel and its supporters to be describing Israel as the one defending itself.
Yes.
You only have to look at the pictures. It's kind of pathological to describe what Israel did in Gaza. Basically, Gaza has disappeared. It's been flattened. And the idea that they're after Hamas, it's all nonsense. And people who can say this are suffering some kind of, delusion because it's morally and intellectually indefensible. And Israel is the fourth most powerful military in the world. The people in Gaza don't have one tank. They don't have one aeroplane. They don't have anything. So they've got these pissy little rockets, And so the idea that Israel is defending itself is a kind of absurdity. And how people can convince themselves of such nonsense, it tells you the effect of propaganda. And what can one say when there's been a near genocide now?
Yes.
That's been, as it's described by the United Nations. But as you said, immense violations of human rights for years before. I mean, they were starving the population deliberately.
Yes.
And periodically murdering them. So, yeah, one has to see it in historical context, and one has to try to support the Palestinians and oppose the propaganda.
Yes, and I've heard somewhere that it is even unfair to call it a war, because a war between Israel and Palestine. Because if you talk about a war, then you need to have it. The two of the powers has to be in the same level. But now, imagine looking at it, you can see videos of the IDF soldiers fighting with kids, just throwing stones towards them. So is it fair? You can see the unbalance there, and. As we are reaching the end of this conversation, what is your final advice to our listeners out there on how can they equip themselves, prepare themselves in helping on how can they do better in supporting Palestinians and do justice for Palestinians?
Well, look, it's a good question, but it's what we're already doing. In Malaysia especially, there's a very strong Palestine activist movement. The boycott, divestment, sanctions movement is very effective here. Malaysia is exemplary in its support and its activism. It's a good model. We need to make it impactful around the world and join with others. It's a good question how to get governments, I think, in the end, to shift around the world. We need to perhaps put diplomatic pressure. It's hard to know what different we could do because what we're doing is effective as one can be under the circumstances. And perhaps it's more difficult in other countries where the governments are not as favourable towards the Palestinian cause. In Australia, for example, it's very difficult. The government really has been sitting on its hands doing little or nothing.
Okay.
And America is worse because it's been arming Israel.
Yes.
We have to put pressure on these forces to stop the genocide and start to reverse the horrible crimes that have been committed.
And we shouldn't be belittled of every single effort that being put in showing support to Palestinians. It all matters because I believe that to put down a big organization or a big criminal organizations like Israel, it has to start from inside. So it started from the citizens itself, pressuring the government into what they really want, the decision they really want. So in this context, we want Palestine to be free in the end of the day, because after all the apartheid, all the oppressions are being done towards them. And with that being said, I would like to thank Professor Peter Slezak for his insight on today's conversation. And to our listeners, thank you very much for listening to us. If you have any questions or would like to share your thoughts on today's conversation, you can leave in on the comment section of this posting on Facebook and YouTube, or you can simply contact us through our WhatsApp conti at 011-29004-004. And again, Professor, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
And dear listeners, don't forget to tune to us next for more conversation. All this only on IKIM FM, Inspirasi Utama.